It was a cold evening in a city that had long been known for its calm, almost serene appearance. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional sound of a passing car, its headlights briefly illuminating the narrow alleyways before fading into darkness. The sky was an inky black, and the streetlights flickered faintly as if to mirror the unsettling atmosphere that hung in the air. This was a city where power had long been concentrated in the hands of a few, people whose influence shaped everything, from the judicial system to the underworld. Yet beneath the seemingly peaceful exterior, something much darker simmered. The crime scene was a plush, high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. It was the kind of place where business deals were made behind closed doors, and power brokers rubbed elbows with influential figures. Tonight, the restaurant was unusually empty, save for a few patrons seated at distant tables. The aroma of expensive wine and rich food filled the air, but it did little to disguise the tension that lingered like a heavy fog. A small group gathered, in a private booth, where a conversation would soon spiral into violence. At that moment, no one could predict that this quiet establishment, the scene of so many whispered deals and covert plans, would soon bear witness to something far more sinister. Among the people present was a man whose name everyone knew, but no one dared to cross. A mafia boss known only to those within the criminal world. His name carried weight, and with it, a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of many. He was a master of manipulation, wielding power like a chess player moving pieces on a board, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But tonight, as he sat at the table, his usual air of control was shattered by an unexpected presence. A judge, one of the most respected in the city, sat opposite him. To the outside world, their relationship was one of respect, even admiration. The judge was the epitome of authority and fairness, someone who held the public's trust in his hands. But within the walls of this restaurant, their relationship was far more complex and much darker than anyone could have imagined. For years, the mafia boss and the judge had maintained a secret alliance, one built on mutual benefit. The judge had used his position to ensure the boss's criminal empire thrived, turning a blind eye to the law in exchange for money, power, and protection. Their dealings were smooth, almost invisible to the public eye, but under the surface, the trust they shared was fragile. Both men were aware of the delicate balance they maintained, and both knew that one misstep could destroy everything. But tonight, something had changed. The mafia boss sensed it in the air, a subtle shift that he could not ignore. The judge, who had always been so calm and composed, seemed on edge. His eyes darted nervously around the room as if he feared someone might be watching. The mafia boss noticed it but said nothing, choosing instead to savor the wine in his glass, allowing the tension to build between them. As the night wore on, the conversation took a darker turn. Words that had once been spoken in hushed tones now carried a hint of threat. The judge, who had always been so assured in his position of power, seemed increasingly uncertain. The mafia boss could see it. This was no longer the trusted ally he had once known. The judge was beginning to question their arrangement, perhaps even plotting to end it. And that, to the mafia boss, was unforgivable. A crack had formed in the foundation of their carefully constructed world, and he knew that cracks, no matter how small, could destroy everything. In the quiet of the restaurant, beneath the polished surface of polite conversation and the clinking of glasses, the true nature of their relationship was laid bare. Power, greed, and the thirst for control had driven both men to the edge, and neither was willing to step back. What had once been a symbiotic alliance had now become a deadly game, one in which only one could emerge victorious. But neither of them realized that the danger they faced was not just from each other. There were forces outside their control, forces that would soon come into play, pushing their fragile alliance past the point of no return. And when the first blood was spilled, it would not be just their lives that were torn apart. The ripple effects of that night would affect everyone in their world, from the powerful elite to the helpless victims caught in the crossfire. As the clock ticked on, the world outside remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break. The tension in the air was palpable, and the stage was set for a tragedy that would shake the city to its core. In the coming hours, secrets would be exposed, lives would be destroyed, and the world of the Mafia boss and the judge would unravel in the most brutal and unforgiving way possible. The tension that had built over the years between the Mafia boss and the judge began to shift in a more dangerous direction. Their once seamless partnership, built on a mutual understanding of power, control, and quiet corruption, started to fray at the edges. It was subtle at first, small glances, a tone of voice that wasn't quite right, but these small cracks soon became chasms that no one could ignore. It was not just one incident that set the stage for the inevitable clash, but a combination of personal and external pressures that mounted over time. The Mafia boss, a man whose every move had been calculated and precise, began to feel the shift in the dynamic between them. He had always prided himself on his ability to control people, to bend them to his will. But lately, the judge had become more distant, less willing to bend to the boss's commands. At first, it seemed like a minor annoyance, a small shift in the balance of power. But as time passed, the Mafia boss began to feel that something much larger was at play. There were whispers in the underworld, rumors that the judge was seeking a way out of their arrangement. He had become more involved in politics, showing an interest in cleaning up the city's judicial system, and the boss couldn't ignore the implications. There was one moment, a seemingly insignificant conversation during one of their meetings that would stick in the Mafia boss's mind for weeks. The judge had mentioned, almost offhandedly, his desire to bring some order to the chaos in the city. It was a comment that, at the time, seemed innocent enough. But to the Mafia boss, who thrived in the very chaos the judge sought to control, it sounded like a direct threat. The boss's eyes narrowed as the judge spoke, his mind racing to piece together the hidden meaning behind the words. Was the judge planning to turn on him? Was his control over the city's power structure slipping? As the days went by, the pressure of maintaining their relationship began to take its toll on both men. The Mafia boss's paranoia grew. He had always been a man who trusted no one, but now, the very foundation of his empire felt unstable. The judge, on the other hand, was beginning to feel trapped in a life he no longer wanted. The weight of his secret dealings with the Mafia had been bearing down on him for years. It had started with small favors, turning a blind eye to criminal activity, making sure certain cases went the right way. But over time it had spiraled into something darker. He had become entangled in a world where justice had no place, and the consequences of betrayal were deadly. But the rising tension was not just confined to the relationship between the Mafia boss and the judge. There were external pressures that contributed to the situation's volatility. The judge had been under increasing scrutiny from his colleagues. His recent behavior, his political ambitions, and his close ties to the underworld were raising red flags. The public was beginning to question his integrity, and the media was starting to dig deeper into his past. The pressure to maintain his position and the growing fear of exposure weighed heavily on him. At the same time, he had debts that went beyond money, debts that the Mafia boss had helped him manage. But now the judge found himself unable to repay those debts in ways that would keep him in the Mafia boss's favor. Meanwhile, the Mafia boss, ever the strategist, was also facing his own set of pressures. Business was no longer as smooth as it had once been. His rivals were becoming more brazen, testing his dominance in the city. There were murmurs of a new player entering the game, a younger, more ruthless figure whose ambitions threatened to eclipse the Mafia boss's empire. With this new threat looming, the boss's need to maintain control of the judge became more urgent. He needed the judge's loyalty, not just for the protection it provided, but as a key player in his efforts to solidify his reign. The judge, however, was beginning to pull away, and the Mafia boss could sense it. As the tension mounted, old grievances began to surface. The Mafia boss had always been the dominant force in their relationship, but now, the judge's resentment started to show. The years of quiet manipulation, of being controlled by the Mafia boss, had taken their toll. He had been the one who had always played the role of the respected, untouchable authority figure. But deep down, he knew he had allowed himself to become a pawn. The more he thought about it, the more the anger built inside him. He had once believed that he could handle both sides of the law, serve justice while also profiting from the criminal world. But now he realized that he had sold his soul. The judge's internal struggle grew more intense with each passing day. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was in too deep, that the man sitting across from him at the table was more of a master than a partner. The guilt weighed on him, and so did the fear of what would happen if he crossed the Mafia boss. But the idea of freeing himself from the Mafia's grip began to appeal to him more and more. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Leaving would mean betraying the boss, and the consequences of that would be deadly. But could he continue to live a double life, knowing the cost of his silence? In the midst of all this, the Mafia boss's obsession with the judge reached new heights. He couldn't afford to lose the judge's loyalty. Not now, not when the stakes were so high. The Mafia boss was used to having everything under control, but with the judge pulling away, his grip on the situation was slipping. This obsession, the fear of losing what he had worked so hard to build, began to cloud his judgment. He had always been a man of action, and now his mind raced with the possibilities of what he might have to do to keep the judge in line. The Mafia boss had a way of making people fear him, and he had always believed that fear was the key to power. But now, that fear was beginning to turn inward, to poison him. The moment of confrontation between the two men seemed inevitable. Every small incident, the judge's distant behavior, the Mafia boss's mounting paranoia, was leading them toward an explosion. It was no longer a matter of trust. It was a matter of survival. Both men had crossed lines they could not uncross, and the weight of their decisions would soon come crashing down upon them. There were no more games. The rising tension was no longer just a product of their relationship. It had become a force of its own, propelled by external forces, internal struggles, and the need to maintain control at all costs. With the clock ticking, it was only a matter of time before the fragile alliance shattered completely, and the bloodshed that had been building in the shadows would finally spill into the open. The night had fallen heavy and oppressive, the shadows growing longer as the tension between the Mafia boss and the judge finally reached its breaking point. The city, with its chaotic mix of noise and silence, seemed unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. But within the confines of a dimly lit, secluded office on the outskirts of town, the two men faced each other, no longer able to pretend that things could go back to normal. The air between them was thick, crackling with unspoken accusations and a sense of betrayal that neither could ignore. The Mafia boss had come here tonight with a single purpose: to reclaim control. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his empire pressing down on him. The judge, who had once been a trusted ally, had become a threat, a liability that needed to be eliminated before it was too late. The Mafia boss had always believed that fear was the ultimate tool in maintaining power, but now, fear gripped him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the judge's potential betrayal, it was the thought of losing everything he had built. As they sat across from one another, the silence between them grew louder. The judge, his face pale under the harsh light, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had known this moment was coming, yet he had hoped desperately that it wouldn't. But the cold glint in the Mafia boss's eyes told him everything he needed to know. There was no more negotiating, no more subtlety. The Mafia boss was done playing games. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you?" The Mafia boss's voice was low, but there was an edge to it that cut through the silence like a blade. The judge, his hands trembling ever so slightly, met the Mafia boss's gaze. "I've given you everything," he replied, his voice cracking with the weight of years of guilt and fear. "Everything you wanted. But this has to end. I can't keep doing this." A smirk curled at the corners of the Mafia boss's lips. "You think you have a choice?" He leaned forward, his presence dominating the room. "You think you can just turn your back on me? On us? You know what happens to people who try to betray me?" The judge's eyes flickered, the fear momentarily breaking through his facade, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm not betraying you," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm trying to save myself." That was the moment the Mafia boss snapped. There was no grand warning, no dramatic build-up, just a flash of anger that was enough to send the room into chaos. In an instant he stood up, his hand grabbing something from the table, something cold and heavy. A gun. The judge had seen it before, of course, but never this close, never in this context. It was the weapon of someone who had no intention of letting things go. The click of the safety being released echoed in the room like a death sentence. The judge's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing as his body tensed, ready to react, but frozen by fear. He had never thought it would end like this. He had always known that he was playing with fire, but he never imagined the flames would consume him so quickly. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their ragged breathing. The Mafia. Boss's eyes were wild, his emotions a storm of rage and betrayal. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he repeated, his voice shaking with fury. "I gave you everything, everything." His grip on the gun tightened, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Now you will pay the price." The judge, his mind racing, tried to think of something, anything that could diffuse the situation. His entire life had led him to this moment, and he realized with a sickening clarity that there was no escape. He had put himself in this position, and now there was no way out. His last thought was of his family, his wife, his children, and the life they would never have. But that thought faded quickly as he felt the barrel of the gun press against his chest. "Please," the judge whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted this. Please, just let me go." But the Mafia boss didn't hesitate. The gunshot rang out like a thunderclap in the small room, deafening in its finality. The judge's body jerked back as the bullet struck, his eyes wide, with shock and pain. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. His hands clutched at his chest, and then, as if everything in the world had gone still, he slumped forward, his face crumpling in the weight of his own blood. For a moment, the Mafia boss stood there, the gun still in his hand, staring at the judge's lifeless body. His mind was a blur, his thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. What had he just done? The question echoed in his mind, but it was a question that had no answer. In the end, there was only one thing left to do. He couldn't let this be known, couldn't let anyone find out what had happened here. The consequences would be disastrous. Panic began to claw at him. He turned quickly, glancing around the room as if expecting the walls to close in on him. He needed to clean up, to make sure there was no trace left behind. His fingers trembled as he wiped the gun with a cloth, his eyes flicking back to the judge's body, the blood pooling around him like a dark sea. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but there was no turning back now. The moment had passed. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the crime that had just unfolded. The Mafia boss, his pulse racing, moved quickly, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. He had never allowed himself to think this would happen, never allowed himself to believe that he could be so reckless, so impulsive. But here he was, standing over the body of the man he had once called a partner. The emotional turmoil within him was raw, a mix of regret, fear, and something darker. The guilt would come later, he was sure of that. But right now all that mattered was that the judge was gone. The weight of the crime settled over him like a heavy fog, and though he knew he couldn't undo what had been done, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been worth it. The first signs of dawn began to creep through the window, the faint light casting long shadows across the room. The Mafia boss took one last look at the judge's body, and without a word, turned and left the room. The crime had been committed, and now all that was left was the aftermath, the panic, the lies, and the desperate attempts to cover it up. The days after the crime unfolded like a slow, suffocating descent into chaos. The Mafia boss, once a figure of authority and fear, now found himself trapped in the aftermath of his own actions. At first, he tried to convince himself that everything would go back to normal, that the body would be disposed of, that no one would ever find out what had truly happened. But the weight of what he had done pressed down on him like an unbearable burden, its reality creeping in with each passing hour. In the stillness of his darkened apartment, He paced back and forth, his mind consumed by the image of the judge's face. Frozen in that moment of shock and pain, it was all he could see, the blood staining the walls of his mind. The guilt gnawed at him, clawing its way through his defenses, but he refused to confront it. Instead, he did what he always did in times of trouble. He turned to control. He reached out to his associates, making calls, ordering them to handle the cleanup, to make sure no one connected him to the crime. But deep inside, he knew it was a lie. No amount of money or power could erase the truth. He had killed the man who had once been his ally, his partner in a world of crime, and no amount of manipulation could change that. The first time he caught his reflection in the mirror, the man staring back at him was a stranger. His eyes hollow, his face drawn, the life he had lived suddenly meaningless. Despite his attempts to bury the truth beneath layers of deception, cracks began to appear. His associates, once loyal, now looked at him with suspicion. Whispers started to circulate in the underworld, and the once invincible Mafia boss began to feel the walls closing in. He had always been careful, always calculated, but now every move he made was a risk. His grip on his empire started to slip, and he could feel it. The guilt was not just personal, it was professional. His empire, built on fear, was now crumbling under the weight of his own conscience. Meanwhile, the judge's family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. His wife, devastated by the sudden loss of her husband, refused to believe what had happened. In her grief, she could not fathom the truth. She told herself that the judge had been a good man, a man who had lived with integrity and honor. It was hard for her to accept that the man she had loved for so long had become entangled in such dangerous dealings, had allowed himself to be manipulated by a man like the Mafia boss. But the truth began to bleed through, one tear-streaked conversation at a time. Rumors spread and the pieces started to fit together. The emotional toll on her was unbearable. She felt abandoned by the man she had once trusted completely. There was no closure, no way to say goodbye, and that was perhaps the hardest part. She was left alone with 1,000 unanswered questions and a shattered sense of security. What had really happened between her husband and the Mafia boss? Had he been part of something dangerous for years? Or had this been an unfortunate, unavoidable consequence? No matter how much she searched for answers, she couldn't bring him back. Their children, too, were left in the wake of the tragedy. They had lost a father, and in their grief, they struggled to understand why it had happened. They were too young to comprehend the full scope of the situation, but the whispers in the streets, the news reports, the gossip, began to paint a picture they could not ignore. Their father's name was dragged through the mud, his reputation torn apart. It was a slow, painful process, but their innocence was lost as they realized that the man they had loved was not as simple as they had thought. The community, too, was shaken by the crime. The judge had been a respected figure, his reputation impeccable. His colleagues, his neighbors, and even those who had barely known him, felt the impact of his death. They spoke in hushed tones, wondering, what had gone wrong? How could a man so esteemed fall into the grip of such a dangerous world? Some whispered that the Mafia boss had always been in control, that the judge had been forced into submission, his moral compass lost in a sea of corruption. Others speculated that the judge had been more involved than anyone had known, that he had been a willing participant in the crimes that had now cost him his life. The truth was elusive, and as the weeks went on, the community's perception of the judge became increasingly divided. The media had a field day with the story. Headlines screamed about the betrayal, the corruption, the hidden relationship between the Mafia boss and the judge. The public, always hungry for scandal, devoured every detail with morbid fascination. They painted the Mafia boss as a monster, a ruthless figure who had been behind the judge's downfall. Some even sympathized with the judge's family, mourning a man who had been betrayed by his own choices. Others, however, were less kind. They questioned the judge's integrity, his loyalty, and his true role in the criminal world. As the investigation into the crime unfolded, it became clear that the Mafia boss's grip on his empire was slipping. Law enforcement had begun to piece together the details of the judge's death, and the pressure was mounting. The Mafia boss found himself trapped in a web of lies, unable to maintain the facade any longer. His past decisions, his manipulation of the judge, his willingness to resort to violence to maintain control, had all led to this moment. Now it was only a matter of time before the law caught up with him. The weight of the crime, the guilt of his actions, the fear of being caught, it was all too much to bear. And as the Mafia boss continued to fight to keep his world intact, he knew that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was beginning to unravel. In the end, there was no escape. The judge's death had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. The Mafia boss's empire was crumbling, and the truth was beginning to come to light. No amount of power, money, or manipulation could change the fact that lives had been lost, reputations destroyed, and families torn apart. The aftermath of the crime had left a trail of destruction, and no one, not even the Mafia boss, could outrun the consequences forever. The story of the Mafia boss and the judge reached its painful conclusion in a way that left no room for redemption or closure. As the months passed after the crime, the legal system began to tighten its grip. Despite the Mafia boss's best efforts to cover his tracks, the investigation had pieced together the damning evidence against him. It became clear that he had orchestrated the entire sequence of events that led to the judge's brutal end. With his empire of crime now crumbling around him, he could no longer evade the law. His former allies, once loyal and fearful of him, turned on him, and his network of influence began to unravel. The Mafia boss was arrested, his name plastered across headlines for all the wrong reasons. As the trial began, the judge's family found themselves watching from the sidelines, struggling to come to terms with what had transpired. For his wife, the grief was not just over the loss of her husband, but the shocking realization of his involvement in a world she had never fully understood. She had spent years believing in his integrity, and now that belief was shattered. The evidence against the Mafia boss was undeniable, but the question of the judge's complicity loomed large. Had he been a victim, coerced into this dark alliance? Or had he been a willing participant driven by his own ambitions? In the end, the truth was somewhere in between, and it left a stain on the judge's legacy that would never be erased. The legal consequences for the Mafia boss were swift and unforgiving. His conviction was nearly certain, and he faced a lengthy sentence in a maximum security prison. His life, once defined by power and fear, was now reduced to a single, unchangeable reality. He was a criminal. But even as he sat in that cold courtroom awaiting his fate, there was a strange sense of finality to it all. He had spent his life evading justice, manipulating those around him, and using his wealth and influence to control everything. But in the end, it was his own actions, his own decisions, that had brought him to this moment. No amount of money could save him now. The judge's family, though left with the painful loss of their patriarch, did find some form of resolution in the court's decision. The guilt and shame of his actions would forever haunt them, but there was a small measure of justice in the conviction of the Mafia boss. They were left to rebuild their lives, though the damage had already been done. The judge's name would always be associated with the tragedy, and the family's ability to heal from the emotional scars remained uncertain. Public opinion, once swayed in favor of the judge, now shifted toward a more complex view of the case. The media, having initially portrayed the Mafia boss as the sole villain, began to shift its narrative. They spoke of a man caught between two worlds, unable to escape his own choices. There was no easy way to categorize the judge. Was he a victim of circumstance, or was he complicit in the crimes that led to his untimely death? The public's perception of the judge was no longer as clear-cut as it had once been. Some people felt sympathy for him, while others viewed him as just another cog in the machine of corruption. His reputation had been forever tainted, and no amount of public relations could change that. The case itself had a profound impact on the community and beyond. It exposed the murky intersection between power, corruption, and the law. It showed how easy it was for someone in a position of influence like the judge to be drawn into the criminal world. It also demonstrated the lengths to which people would go to protect their own interests, even at the cost of others' lives. Society, for all its claims of justice and fairness, was not immune to the lure of power and the temptations of greed. The case underscored the fragile nature of human morality and the complexity of human motivations. Looking beyond the individuals involved, the crime shed light on broader societal issues that could not be ignored. It highlighted the systemic flaws within the justice system, where people in positions of power often operated with a sense of invincibility. The case was a stark reminder that the law, while meant to be impartial, was often influenced by money, influence, and personal agendas. The Mafia boss had been able to operate with such ease because the system had allowed him to. The judge's involvement, whether forced or voluntary, was an example of how those in power could become entangled in a web of corruption that led them to betray their own values. The theme of power dynamics ran deep throughout the case. Both the Mafia boss and the judge were characters shaped by their desire for control. The Mafia boss sought power through fear and manipulation, using violence to maintain his dominance. The judge, on the other hand, sought power through the law, believing that his position would shield him from the darker forces around him. Both men's desires for control ultimately led to their downfall. The Mafia boss lost everything: his empire, his freedom, and his reputation. The judge, though dead, lost his honor, his family's trust, and his legacy. In the end, the price of power was higher than either of them could have imagined. This case also served as a reminder of the fragile nature of morality. At the core of this tragedy was a human flaw: the willingness to compromise one's values for personal gain. The judge, who had spent his career upholding justice, allowed himself to become ensnared in a world of crime and corruption. The Mafia boss, who had no moral compass to begin with, was able to manipulate those around him, including the judge. In both cases, human weaknesses, greed, fear, and pride played a crucial role in the unfolding tragedy. As the dust settled, the true cost of the crime became clear. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but it was impossible to ignore the emotional toll it had taken on everyone involved. The judge's family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, and the community, once confident in their trust in the law, now faced a harsh reality. Those who were supposed to protect them were just as fallible as anyone else. The Mafia boss would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but his actions would never be forgotten. He had left a mark on everyone, from his victims to the people who had once admired him. The judge's actions, too, would forever echo through the corridors of justice, serving as a cautionary tale of how easily one could slip into darkness when they believed they were invincible. In the end, no one was truly victorious. The story of the Mafia boss and the judge was a tragedy, one that exposed the cracks in a system built on power, trust, and the illusion of control. As the world moved on, the lessons learned from this crime would resonate for years to come. Reminders of the complexities of human nature, the dangers of unchecked power, and the devastating consequences of betrayal.